said, I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Roger, and thank you everyone for being here. I've been a long-time admirer of the Security Studies program. So I'm thrilled to be here presenting today some work from a series of projects that span my two core research interests on forced displacement and counterinsurgency. And I promise that although kind of refugees don't necessarily fit the typical bill for international security or security studies, I will at least in passing mention the Iran nuclear deal and counter-proliferation sanctions. So stay tuned for that. And before I get into the project, I have to mention my fantastic co-authors on this work, Austin Wright, who is an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and Benjamin Crick, who is a PhD student at Duke University. Okay, so forced displacement is arguably the gravest humanitarian concern around the world today. There are roughly 110 million people forcibly displaced, either internally or across borders. 46 million of those 110 are displaced across borders. They are refugees. And if we look at this is a historical high, if we look at 2023, approximately 13% of the global share of forcibly displaced people originate from Afghanistan. This is pretty typical of the past 45 years or so. Since 1979, between 10 and 33% of all forcibly displaced people have originated from the country of Afghanistan. Now, obviously, we've seen some very recent episodes of forced displacement centered in Afghanistan, notably in August 2021, when the US military finally withdrew from the country. Hundreds of thousands of people crowded Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul, seeking to escape with US military forces. Around August 2021, it's estimated that more than 1 million Afghans ultimately fled the country, most to Pakistan or to Iran, the two kind of historically largest host countries for Afghans. And obviously, this is a crisis that over the past 45 years has not really found suitable solutions. More recently, the willingness of major host countries like Pakistan and Iran to continue hosting large populations of Afghans has been declining. As recently as November 1st, 2023, the Pakistani government announced a new program to expel up to 1.7 million Afghans from the country. And it's estimated that since November 1st, about 350 or 400,000 Afghans have been expelled from the country of Pakistan back into Afghanistan, which is obviously still quite a fragile and conflict-affected setting. This episode characterizes a kind of broader fact about forced displacement, which is that around the world, we've seen a real collapse of the three so-called durable solutions for refugees. The first of those solutions, refugee resettlement, entails moving a refugee from a global south or developing host country to a global north country where they will get permanent residency or citizenship. This is the most common way that refugees arrive in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and other major global north host countries. But as you can see over time, fewer than 0.5% of all refugees around the world in any given year have access to this durable solution. The second durable solution is naturalization in a global south host country, right? So refugees attaining permanent status in a country like Pakistan or Iran. And again, over time, naturalization in developing host countries, because of waning political willingness, accounts for less than 0.5% of all refugees that can achieve some sort of durable solution in a given year. Now, the focus of the projects that I'll be talking about today is refugee repatriation. This is the international community's preferred solution to forced displacement. This entails refugees returning to the home or origin country when conditions appear safe enough in that origin country to make a safe and dignified return possible. Over time, we'll see some wide fluctuation in the extent to which repatriation has been possible for refugees. in 2002 with a large influx of Afghans from Pakistan and Iran back to Afghanistan when the Taliban government was deposed by US military intervention. As many as 15% of the world's refugees, and mostly Afghans, returned home. But again, over time, we've seen the collapse of repatriation as a function of increasingly protracted civil wars, which make it difficult to safely return for most of the world's refugees. And so in any given year, fewer than 2% of the world's population of refugees achieves one of these durable solutions. Now, studying refugee repatriation in particular is very difficult for a simple inferential reason, which is that refugee dynamics or forced displacement is fundamentally endogenous to conflict, right? If we look at Afghan refugee flows to Pakistan, we see that they surge in coincidence with major episodes of conflict in the country. So the Soviet invasion sparked the first major wave of Afghans out of the country into Pakistan. We see another spike in 2001 coinciding with the US invasion of the country to overthrow the Taliban. And a third major spike in 2006 with the start of the Taliban resurgence and the real kickoff of counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. And a similar pattern characterizes not just displacement from the country, but return to Afghanistan, right? Looking at Afghan returns from Pakistan in particular, we see these major spikes, a kind of wave-like dynamic, coinciding with brief moments in which conflict subsides and return potentially becomes possible, right? So you have a large spike in return coinciding with the communist collapse in 1992. Another large spike in 2002 as there's some hopefulness around the Hamid Karzai regime that is installed by US forces. And then a third major spike you'll see here, which is the kind of focus of one of the projects I'll present on today, which coincides with a cash grant program in Afghanistan. So unrelated to conflict dynamics. But in general, the major spikes in refugee return also coincide with conflict. And this makes it really, really difficult to empirically disentangle in a credible way how refugee return shapes trajectories of conflict in the communities to which individuals arrive. This is not unique to Afghanistan. We see a similar pattern of endogeneity between refugee repatriation and conflict in a variety of conflicts around the world, right? So looking at Iraq, major spikes in return coinciding with the Kurdish safe zone enforced from the air in the 1990s after the Persian Gulf War, and another major spike in 2003, 2004 with the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime. If we look at Kosovo and the Balkans, right, we see a similarly large spike right at the end of the conflict. Likewise, in Myanmar, brief openings in the conflict in the late 70s and early 1990s made return possible. And similarly in the Mozambican Civil War, we see a large spike coinciding with the end of the conflict. And again, this fundamental endogeneity is a stylized fact about forced displacement, but it also makes it really difficult to disentangle how refugee return should shape conflict in the communities to which people arrive. So I'm going to present evidence today from two projects. These are related projects looking at various episodes in Afghanistan in 2016 and 2018 in particular. Project number one is going to study that cash grant program I mentioned just a moment ago, which was provided to Afghan returnees from Pakistan in 2016. In particular, in June of 2016, repatriation cash assistance for Afghans willing to return from Pakistan to Afghanistan was doubled overnight, and it sparked an unexpected and large-scale return of close to 500,000 Afghan refugees, right? The cash assistance was economically meaningful, $400 per person returning, right? And so this was a huge driver of the return. And importantly, it was rolled out at the start of the 2016 fighting season, which is when the Taliban is recruiting a large pool of part-time fighters to mobilize for the summer offensive. And so if we were to see a positive effect of refugee return on conflict, it would be in a setting like this when you have a large group of people returning home at the same time that the rebel force is recruiting. We study this in a kind of Bartik-style difference in differences design, where we leverage historical returnee settlement patterns to define cross-sectional exposure across districts in Afghanistan to this shock, and then time series variation coming from the unexpected change in the cash assistance program. And importantly, we use some novel and previously unreleased combat records that I received exclusively through a legal data sharing agreement with NATO, negotiated as part of my dissertation research, which represents the successor record to the declassified record of significant activities, or SIGACs, that CENTCOM, US Central Command, has released for the period from 2006 to 2014. So the SIGACs records from CENTCOM are already out there, but they stopped in 2014 when the NATO mission transferred combat responsibility to the Afghan National Security Forces. And I received the successor record covering 2015 to 2020, which makes it possible to study this question with the best available conflict data from the country. What we find is that encashed returns, so returns under this encashment program in 2016, actually coincide with a reduction in insurgent violence in the communities to which individuals return. And we present some suggestive evidence that this occurs through an opportunity cost channel, right? The cash assistance program is sufficiently large that you see intra-communal economic spillovers from refugee returnees to their non-migrant neighbors, raising reservation wages in return communities, and constraining the Taliban's possibility of recruiting those individuals for the summer offensive. An unintended consequence, though, of rising reservation wages is that it also constrains counterinsurgent informing. The Afghan government, and especially US-backed forces in the country, are buying tips, buying civilian information through service provision, and by raising reservation wages from the cash assistance program, you constrain tip buying by increasing the price that civilians demand for information shared with counterinsurgent forces. Turning from insurgent violence to communal or social violence, we find that returns under the encashment program increase communal violence. We're really interested going forward in disentangling precisely why this is the case. Most of the increase is related to land conflict, so returnees going home and claiming ancestral land that has been usurped by non-migrant neighbors. But there's also a potential jealousy dynamic in which non-migrant neighbors feel envious of the cash assistance provided to refugee returnees. Importantly, though, this effect can be offset by social capital and strong local institutions. The second project that I'll present evidence from uses a very similar research design, but looks at the maximum pressure sanctions which crater the Iranian economy in 2018. So the maximum pressure sanctions on the Iran nuclear program lead to a massive currency devaluation beginning in May 2018 in Iran. And this currency devaluation is disproportionately harmful to Afghans, in particular Afghan refugees, most of whom work in the informal sector, so jobs like construction in Iran. In consequence of this economic collapse, about 800,000 Afghans, so a similarly large shock, return home. And this occurs at the start of the 2018 fighting season. So 2 years after the cash grant program, another large shock, right? Importantly, 2018 is the single most violent year of the conflict in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021. Historical returnee settlement patterns again define the cross-sectional exposure to returns in 2018, and we're using those same combat records. So very symmetric research designs, two different contexts, one in which you get encashed returns, so people coming back with cash assistance, and a second in which the returnees are destitute because of the economic collapse in Iran. And what we find is essentially symmetrically opposite effects from Project 1. Impoverished returnees increase insurgent violence. Again, we present some evidence that this occurs through an opportunity cost channel. It's easier for the Taliban to recruit this large pool of destitute individuals who are returning at a time in the start of the fighting season when the Taliban is interested in increasing its mobilization. We also find, symmetric with Project 1, that the destitute returnees are more willing to sell information to the government at a lower cost, right? So informing to the counterinsurgent force increases. And importantly, we actually don't find any effect of these impoverished or destitute returnees on communal violence in the country. Again, we're really interested in probing the mechanisms behind communal violence, but it's quite possible that the absence of that jealousy dynamic that I mentioned in Project 1 is doing a good bit of the work here in explaining why there's not an increase in communal violence in this setting. Okay, so the big takeaway from this project is that the conditions of return are really central for understanding the effect of repatriation on violence. And in particular, I'm proud of the theory building work that we do in the project to understand the kind of context of refugee repatriation and make theory on how that shapes the effect on conflict. Existing work has tended to focus on one way or one reason that refugees return to their origin country, which is because of improving opportunities at home, right? Either an improving security situation at home or an economic boom at home sees people return home. And there is some existing work on this important question. But our projects point to two other reasons that people might actually return home. One is because of an exogenous reduction in the cost of mobility, right? So provided a cash grant, refugees can afford to go home. And this is a very different setting than when they're returning home because of an improving opportunity or better security at home. This also suggests an underappreciated fact that credit might actually be one of the key constraints on refugee repatriation, right? People simply cannot afford the journey home. Second, in Project 2, we highlight a third reason that people might actually consider returning, which is not improving opportunities at home, but worsening conditions in the host country, right? We focus on recession and unemployment stemming from the Iran nuclear sanctions. But as I mentioned, in Pakistan more recently, this significant policy restriction starting in November 2023 has also seen people returning home. And so various ways that the refugee repatriation context matters here for understanding the effect on conflict. Our project also speaks to this big question about how refugee return affects conflict in origin countries. And we're kind of adjudicating a series of perspectives that are in the extant literature. So on the one hand, some literature suggests that forced displacement, and especially refugee return, might actually worsen militancy because you have the cross-border diffusion of a large population that is exposed to conflict. They might form a ripe source of insurgent recruits, and they might exacerbate institutional fragility in these fragile and conflict-affected settings, which often characterize the places that produce large refugee populations. We might also think from extant literature about how refugees and refugee returnees could worsen social conflict, right? In particular, if there's a fragile demographic or ethnic balance that is disrupted by returns. And in particular, work by Stephanie Schwartz, among others, also highlights competition over land and jobs as a central cause of potential social conflict in these settings. A third perspective that characterizes some of the more recent literature on this question, however, suggests that refugees might actually lead to improvements in security, in particular when they are afforded aid that spills over to non-migrant neighbors, right? So the externalities of refugee aid is one thing that we talk in particular about in Project 1 on the cash grant program. And so we provide some evidence across these projects on this important literature as well. Moving straight into the context here, because there's a lot of results that I want to show you, right? So as I mentioned, Afghanistan is one of the historically most important cases for forced displacement. It's estimated that 20 to 30% of all Afghans have been displaced abroad at some point in time. Many of them have been displaced multiple times, right? The overall refugee population in Pakistan at the time of the 2016 cash grant program is about 1.5 million. And for the past 42 years, Pakistan has been a top 5 refugee hosting country around the world. It's been the single largest host of refugees for roughly half of those 42 years, right? So this is a really important context. And again, about a third of the refugees registered in Pakistan in 2016 take up the cash grant program and return. Okay, so what precipitates this sudden doubling of the cash assistance available for Afghans in Pakistan is an attack by the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP. It has a very tenuous relationship with the Afghan Taliban. But the TTP attacked a school in Peshawar, which is one of the major refugee hosting regions of the country, in December 2014. This is one of the worst school massacres in history. And it leads to a wave of anti-Afghan xenophobia in the tribal regions of Pakistan, spurred by misinformation about the perpetrators of the attack. Right? The Pakistani government, rather, allows rumors to spread, essentially painting Afghan refugees as the perpetrators of this attack. In actuality, there is no link between Afghan refugees and the perpetrators of the attack. But this wave of xenophobia spurs real concern in the Pakistani government, and they enter into private negotiations with UNHCR in 2015 and the first 6 months of 2016 over what to do about the refugee situation. And in particular, the government wants to reduce their hosting burden. So in these private negotiations with the UNHCR, Pakistan threatens to allow the refugee registration cards of Afghans in the country to expire. These cards govern access to food aid, mobile SIM cards, and jobs. And so allowing them to expire would have a real negative consequence for the refugees in the country. And as a product of these internal negotiations, UNHCR agrees to double the cash assistance available to Afghans to return home as a way of helping to reduce the Pakistani government's hosting burden. This policy is announced virtually overnight in late June 2016, and the repatriation cash assistance payment doubles again from $200 to $400. I'll give you a sense of the economic meaning of that amount in just a moment. But if we look at the figure here, right, the black line represents registered returns. These are the returns that are eligible for the cash assistance program. The people that register with UNHCR say, I want to go home, and then go home. The dotted line represents undocumented returnees, so these are people that cross without UNHCR facilitation. Historically undocumented returnees who are not eligible for the cash program exceed the number of registered returnees. But we see that dynamic flip in the period in which this doubled cash program occurs, right? And that's consistent with a deliberate effort of refugees to take advantage of the cash assistance program by returning through the registered route, which makes them eligible for this additional cash assistance, right? And this is quite a large spike. In terms of the value of the cash, right, it's very economically meaningful because it's paid on an individual rather than a household basis, right? It's an additional $200 per person. So for the median family, which returns with about 9 people, of whom 3 are fighting age males, they're receiving about $3,600, which represents an entire fighting season's worth of income would those males mobilize in the summer offensive. Put differently, we can think about this in terms of GDP per capita or wages. It's at least several months of wages or rent that each individual is provided. And importantly, we can show you a survey-based validation, which suggests that the beneficiaries of this program self-report financing their return through aid from the UNHCR. All right? We have a survey of Afghan refugee returnees from the Asia Foundation in 2018. We can back out, based on the reported country of origin and time of return, who is likely to be an encashment beneficiary. And we find that across these specifications, these individuals report financing their aid with UNHCR funding, so a nice validity check. All right, to give you some sense of the encashment procedure here, individuals move from these gray dots, which are refugee settlements in Pakistan, to the purple tents, which are voluntary repatriation centers, where they register with UNHCR and say, I want to go home. They're biometrically registered, so no one can claim this cash assistance twice. And once they register at one of these purple tents, they have a week to get to a border crossing, and then to get to an encashment center marked with the red hashes here in Afghanistan. The encashment centers are where this doubled cash assistance is paid out. And then from those centers, individuals are free to return to any district in Afghanistan that they choose. And we observe the complete roster of individuals that arrive at these encashment centers and return in Afghanistan. Okay. So as I mentioned, the conflict data are novel data shared by NATO under a legal agreement that I negotiated as part of my dissertation research. This is from the International Distributed Unified Reporting Environment, which is the successor to the existing declassified record of conflict up to 2014 that CENTCOM has shared publicly. We also measure communal violence, and we do this through a combination of survey-based items from that survey of refugee returnees, as well as some text analysis of a US government-sponsored conflict event tracker. And to give you some sense, right, we don't observe whether the individual conflict events in this communal violence data set involve returnees, but we do observe in most cases that they're associated with land conflict. Okay, to give you just some sense about the distribution of violence, as you might expect, it's quite widespread around the country across tactics, but in particular in the border regions along the Afghan border, which is historically the kind of heartland of the Taliban. As I mentioned, we also have comprehensive refugee repatriation data shared by UNHCR's Afghanistan office for 2013 and 14, as well as 2016. 2016 is the program period, and we're using these earlier years to define cross-sectional exposure on the basis of historical settlement patterns. So again, we can see that the number of refugee returnees under this cash grant program is closely linked with settlement around the border regions with Pakistan. As I mentioned, we also have evidence from the survey of refugee returnees fielded by the Asia Foundation, so some complementary bits of evidence here. The empirical strategy is a Bartik-style difference in differences design where we're going to leverage this temporal variation in refugee return coming from the cash grant program and cross-sectional variation coming from historical refugee settlement patterns. And we're just going to estimate a pretty simple least squares equation combining that cross-sectional and temporal variation. But of course, I'm happy in Q&A to show you the full kind of two-stage least squares instrumental variables results as well. To build some confidence in the strategy, I can show you that the 2013 refugee return shares coincide closely with the actual number of returnees during the cash grant program. This is extremely highly correlated, right? So you should be confident that these historical patterns that we're leveraging to define cross-sectional exposure are a close predictor of contemporary destination choices for returnees. And again, happy to talk about this more in Q&A, but the pre-trends look pretty good here. Okay, so lots of results to show, and I'm going to move right into them now. The first kind of baseline result is that across both the extensive margin, so a 0-1, or in per capita levels, we find that the returns under the cash grant program in 2016 are associated with a reduction in insurgent violence. However, they're also associated with increasing communal conflict, right? So this is evidence from an index that we build in the survey, combining a bunch of survey items on experiences of disputes and discrimination. The index is scaled so that higher values indicate better community relations and lower values indicate worse community relations. And we find that encashment beneficiaries systematically report having worse relations with their non-migrant neighbors. We can also back this out in the existing panel data from the US government-sponsored conflict tracker, which covers mostly land conflicts, where again, we see increasing incidents of communal violence in contrast to that reduction in insurgent conflict, right? So those are the baseline set of results. We do a lot of things in the paper to back out the mechanisms here. And the first mechanism that I mentioned is reservation wages. So we know from a lot of existing literature that economic shocks change the opportunity costs of mobilization. And in particular, when opportunities in the illicit economy rise, rebel recruitment should be constrained. We're going to focus on positive intracommunal externalities of the refugee cash grant program, right? So the size of the encashment program for each returnee is large enough that it should spill over to non-migrant neighbors in the returning communities. What this suggests is that in the areas that refugees return to, living standards for everyone are increasing as a result of the cash grant program, and in turn, insurgent recruitment should be constrained. Another observable implication, if we believe that these rising living standards are constraining insurgent recruitment, is that insurgents, now cash-strapped, should substitute from labor-intensive attacks that require a lot of fighters to perpetrate to these more capital-intensive attacks, things that can be perpetrated by a single individual. And so in the context of Afghanistan, we expect a substitution from direct fire incidents, which require a large team of insurgent fighters in direct gunfights with counterinsurgent forces, substituting into IEDs, or improvised explosive attacks, which can be planted by a single individual or a small team of individuals and are relatively more capital than labor intensive. Looking at those labor-intensive tactics, direct fires, and to a lesser extent indirect fires, we see that these are distinguishably lower in the encashment program. In contrast, at least on the extensive margin, the use of explosive violence is increasing. So this overall average reduction in insurgent violence masks important tactical heterogeneity consistent with substitution from labor-intensive to capital-intensive violence. Another way to think about this is to look at the tactic-specific lethality, right? We would expect that the input intensivity of labor or capital is going to shape the lethality of attacks perpetrated through these different tactics. And so, in fact, what we see looking at the average lethality of each tactic is that for the labor-intensive tactics, there's a reduction in average lethality. However, for capital-intensive tactics, the explosive violence, we see increasing lethality. And this actually drives an overall increase in average lethality of insurgent attacks. So even though insurgent violence is going down, the average lethality of insurgent violence is going up because insurgents are reallocating effort into this capital-intensive form of violence. The second big channel that I mentioned was counterinsurgent informing. So we know that counterinsurgents use service provision to buy information, and that economic shocks can alter the price of tips. And so in particular, if the economy gets better, the price of tips should go up because reservation wages are also increasing, right? In a context where you have this large-scale cash grant program, what we expect is the price of tips to increase, and that would constrain information flows to the counterinsurgent force. We don't observe tips in the 2015 to 2020 SIGAX data that we're using here. We do observe tips in the records up to 2014. But we can look at another outcome, which is the success rate of counterinsurgent bomb neutralization missions, right? The proportion of emplaced IEDs that are found and cleared before detonation versus exploded. And when we look at clearance rate, an outcome that we know is highly sensitive to the flow of information from civilians to counterinsurgents, we see that during the cash grant program, the success rate of counterinsurgent bomb neutralization missions is declining, and this is consistent with a reduction in information flows from civilians to counterinsurgents. The third important extension that we study in this first project concerns the role of social capital and local institutions in mitigating communal violence in the communities to which returnees are going. So, in many contexts around the world, we know from extant work that local ties and informal governance structures are central for resolving interpersonal and intracommunal disputes. And in Afghanistan in particular, things like kinship ties, customary law, and shuras, or councils of local elders and notables, are paramount for conflict resolution. We argue that in the context of refugee repatriation, these familial ties and strong local institutions should offset the risks of communal violence. So we should expect heterogeneity in communal violence depending on the local strength of social capital and institutions. I'm happy to talk in Q&A about how we measure social capital and how we measure the strength of local institutions. We do this chiefly through survey data from the pre-treatment period, which allows us to study reliance on things like shuras and families to resolve local disputes, in contrast to reliance on state courts. But when we use either the survey data, which I mentioned earlier, or the actual panel data on the incidence of communal violence, we see that social capital, as approximated through residing in proximity to your family members or returning to your origin district, is offsetting this positive effect of the returns on communal violence. Similarly, if we look at strong local institutions, at least on the extensive margin, so at 0.1 for the incidence of communal conflict, we find that things like areas with a stronger preference for shuras and local village institutions over state courts see a reduction in communal violence despite this overall average positive effect. Okay, so Project 1 offers a lot of evidence around this cash grant program, but that's a pretty atypical context for refugee return, right? It's not often that refugees are paid to go home and they receive this kind of exogenous shock to the mobility cost. So in Project 2, we're interested in studying a kind of more typical return context, which is return that occurs when conditions in the host country worsen significantly. And here, we're going to study Afghan refugees from Iran. Iran, like Pakistan, is a top host country for the past 42 years. Its largest refugee population are Afghans. And in 2018, when the economic sanctions pursuant to the Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, occurred, there's about 1 million Afghans residing in Iran. So return in this context is induced by the sudden onset of the maximum pressure sanctions, which lead to a massive currency devaluation in Iran. In May of 2018, the Trump administration announces its withdrawal from that Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. And in August 2018, we see a full reinstatement of the counter-proliferation sanctions that had been taken down in 2015, pursuant to the Obama administration's negotiations around the Iran nuclear deal. And what this figure is showing you here is the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Iranian rial. And we see a roughly 200% devaluation in the Iranian currency in the spring and summer of 2018, coinciding with the Trump annunciation of the withdrawal. In response, about 800,000 Afghans end up leaving Iran in 2018, and virtually all of these leave after April of 2018, when the devaluation starts. Evidence from a bunch of US Defense Department reports to Congress suggests that the US military is aware of the potential negative consequences of this shock for Afghanistan. In particular, these reports note that they expect about 500,000 returnees from Iran to Afghanistan in 2018, who will carry heavy economic and social support burdens in Western Afghanistan, where many of these individuals return. And in particular, the DoD is concerned that these individuals, most of whom are single male laborers under 30, are going to be very vulnerable to recruitment into extremist groups or the illicit economy, right? So we know the sanctions are economically meaningful, and we know that DoD is concerned about them, but we can also show this using evidence from the Labor Force Survey and the Iranian Household Expenditure and Income Survey, which allow us to empirically validate that the currency devaluation is reducing the expenditures and income of Afghans residing in Iran. Again, most of whom, like these individuals, work in the informal economy and particularly in construction. Okay, so another nice bit of evidence to validate the empirical setup in this second project is that we can use evidence from that survey of Afghan returnees that I've been mentioning from the Asia Foundation. And when we look at individuals that are likely to have returned because of the maximum pressure sanctions, we triangulate this on the basis of country, host country and time of return. We see that the only distinguishable driver of their return for these maximum pressure returnees is poor economic conditions in the host country. All right, again, a virtually symmetric research design here. So cross-sectional exposure is going to come from this IOM data UNHCR data in the first project, IOM data in the second project. That's just because of a division of responsibility in who tracks Afghans in Pakistan versus Iran. But we define cross-sectional exposure to the maximum pressure sanctions, returnees using IOM data. And we also have that returnee, Asia Foundation returnee survey data. To give you some sense about where people go in 2018 when they return from Iran, again, largely in Western Afghanistan, consistent with the DoD reports. And other than that, the empirical specification is the exact same. Same conflict data, the same kind of Bartik-style difference of differences design, and we find virtually symmetrically opposite effects, which is really nice for the theoretical story that we want to tell, right? In contrast to the cash grant program, the returnees who come back under the maximum pressure program are associated with increasing insurgent violence. And the level of this effect is actually quite high, right? As I mentioned, 2018 is the single most violent year of the conflict, but a significant portion of that violence is attributable to violence occurring in these return communities. We don't see any evidence of an effect on communal violence, which is another big contrast with Project One. Right? If anything, there's actually better relations between the maximum pressure returnees from Iran and their non-migrant neighbors. Happy to talk more about that in Q&A, but an important difference there. And again, one natural implication is that it could be jealousy over the cash grant in Project One that drives this kind of animosity between returnees and their non-migrant neighbors. I'm going to wrap up in just a moment here, but going to show you a bit of complementary evidence on reservation wages first, right? So we would expect in this setting, symmetrically opposite of Project One, an increase in the use of labor-intensive as opposed to capital-intensive attacks, because in this context, it's easier for the Taliban to recruit this large pool of destitute returnees. And in fact, looking at tactical diversity and substitution, we see insurgent shifts into these more labor-intensive forms of violence. On the counterinsurgent informing front, again, symmetrically opposite from Project One, we actually see an increasing success rate of the bomb neutralization missions that counterinsurgent forces engage in. So again, to reiterate, in a context in which there is a negative economic shock resulting from the return of these destitute people who were previously sending remittances home but no longer are, the communities that receive returnees from Iran should have reduced reservation wages. That's going to drive down the cost of tips that the government is interested in buying, and that should drive up the success rate of these bomb neutralization missions. And that's precisely what we see. All right, so I'm going to conclude there with some important thoughts, right? So context is really critical for understanding refugee repatriation. That's the big implication of both of these projects, right? There's no easy answer to how will refugee return affect conflict. It's all going to come down to the conditions under which refugee return occurs. And we provide some nice evidence of this through parallel research designs 2 years apart in the same country with symmetrically opposite findings. One important policy implication is that cash assistance might be an important tool for mitigating the effect of refugee return on conflict to these fragile settings like Afghanistan. But of course, there are very, very complex normative considerations. And in particular, we think that refugee return should only occur when it's truly voluntary. But offering cash incentives for people to return arguably undermines the voluntariness of that return decision. And so the kind of normative implications of a kind of cash grant program for refugees are something that UNHCR is still grappling with. Overall, though, I think we offer the first plausibly causal evidence on refugee return and conflict from 2 different settings. We show that refugee return can affect different types of political and social violence in different ways. And we present some important evidence about how the cash transfer in particular spills over to non-migrant neighbors in the destination community. We also provide evidence for some of these classical accounts around opportunity costs in the literature on conflict. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we show that key antecedents for safe refugee repatriation will be building social capital and building legitimate local institutions in the communities to which refugees are going to return. Thank you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, Eric Lynn Greenberg.
Chris, thanks so much. This was super, super interesting. I guess I have a question about Project 2 and kind of this, wonder if there's a relationship, right, between this increased insurgent behavior and decreased communal violence, right? I think you tell us that there's maybe this story of, I'm not as jealous of my neighbors, but is it possible that there's another type of violent substitution effect, right? If I'm off fighting with the Taliban, I might be less likely to be killing my neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. I think that's not something that we've thought through a ton. And it's difficult to think about the empirical implications of one story versus another. But that's absolutely a great suggestion for another alternative explanation for why this happens. If you have ideas as to disentangling this jealousy mechanism for...
I can do some thinking, but maybe I'll shoot you a note.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think in general, though, in my future agenda, nailing evidence of this jealousy dynamic is something that I'm particularly interested in, and so that's a great suggestion, though.
Kunal, you want to come in?
Yeah. Questions for data. One is, how reliable do you think the refugee data is, given that the jump from $200 to $400, massive incentives for corruption, ghost refugees, entries, that part of the world, And another question on the data is on ethnicity. So do you think, I am guessing the ethnicity of the refugees coming from Pakistan would be Pashtuns, from Iran would be Hazaras, maybe Tajiks, Uzbeks. How are you accounting for the difference in ethnicities on violence?
Yeah, those are really great questions. So in terms of the fidelity of the data in the cash grant program, we're very, very confident because this was a biometric registration process, right? UNHCR took painstaking concerns around accounting here. It was largely funded by the US, so there's a strong accountability mechanism built into the cash assistance program there, and we have the entire roster of beneficiaries. In that context, so we're quite sure about who actually receives this cash aid and the fact that no one is receiving it twice and things like that, right? They were actually doing iris scanning and fingerprinting when they gave out the aid. So pretty remarkable in this context to have that high fidelity data. In terms of the ethnic composition, that's absolutely true. I can show you some results. In which we control for other things like ethnic composition of the districts. In general, you're right that most of the returnees from Pakistan and in Project 1 are going to be Pashtun. It's a little bit more of a mixed bag from Iran, although still a good number of them are Pashtuns returning to Kunduz, which is the Pashtun area in the north. Or to the kind of Herat, western Pashtun. So there are some Hazaras inevitably and Tajiks in the second project return population. It's not necessarily clear to me, with the exception of the Hazaras, how that would impact our inferences, right? In 2018, the Taliban is interested in recruiting both Pashtuns and Tajiks. They made it an express concern over time to diversify their kind of recruitment force. They had a large number of Tajik commanders. To the extent that Hazaras are part of this population and they're unlikely for ideological reasons to join the Taliban in any case, it should actually bias against the effect that we're finding, which is an increase in insurgent violence, and particularly Taliban-perpetrated violence. But that's a great question, and I'm happy to. Can you by any chance click this button on the slides over there? I can.
It's that mouse that's right to your left.
Okay. Whoops. Just briefly. Right. So we can control for the district level ethnic fractionalization. radicalization or ethnic polarization, and all of the results hold. That should build some confidence as well, I think, to your first question. But thank you.
Chris, can you just give us a better sense maybe of the substantive differences in the violence versus what you found statistically? Like, what does this actually mean?
Yeah,
as far as,
in terms of the level
yeah,
of
like a
violence.
picture of what's going on at the local level that you saw different, that, can you give us a little bit more of a substantive picture of that?
Yeah, I would absolutely love to kind of build in more qualitative evidence in the paper as to this. And I think it's going to be important for us going forward to estimate like what share of the violence in 2018 is potentially attributable to the returns under the maximum pressure program. As I mentioned, like 2018 is the single most violent year of the conflict. There's something like 60,000 casualties between civilians and Afghan security forces in that year. So, the level of violence is huge, and it's especially high in Western Afghanistan.
But, because some of us that know SIGACs, there's some problems with that data, of course, but can you just tell people here a little bit more about what kind of area, how many types of this type of violence, like killing of people, went down?
Oh, sure, yes. So the data that we have only covers insurgent violence against counterinsurgent forces, right? So the SIGACs data and the kind of successor record that we have are drastically undercounting civilian victimization. So we're only speaking to insurgent violence against counterinsurgent forces. But I'm pretty confident that this is the virtual universe of anti-government violence perpetrated by the insurgents, right? Like there's strong incentives for the Afghan forces and earlier the NATO forces to record with fidelity the extent of violence that they're encountering in the field.
Just on that, I know some of you are military fellows serve in Afghanistan. Did the effects that he's reporting, did you see that in your own deployments? Like when you change the opportunity costs and you get more people, given opportunities away from joining the Taliban, do you have any, can you flesh this out a little bit more from the field?
So what I will say is it sure felt pretty violent in 2013 and 2014 as well. So I think the other confounder that I'd be concerned about, so we saw a lot of IEDs, 2013, 2014, like, a vast amount of the violence, I would say, at least that I saw coming into the hospitals were, IED blasts. That being said, the only thing that changed wasn't, your repatriation, right? So we also developed new technologies to find that we were a little less reliant on finding, on using tips to find said IEDs, right? We brought some things actually that were developed here in Lincoln Lab that helped us find those more effectively, and we put a real punishment on people that were building bombs and whatever. But I don't know, I can't speak to the ground situation as well.
That was confusing to me, because linking counter IED effectiveness, specifically finding and neutralizing explosive devices, to that particular initiative, because up until that, if it's coalition forces, I'm highly doubtful of it because we weren't getting a lot of tips from locals. If we're talking Afghan national security forces, that's a bit of a different situation because they're more embedded in the population generally. But also during that time, you're rolling out a substantial amount of counter IED tactics, equipment, and things like that to those forces, which may be impacting a more effective counter IED strategy for both coalition and ANZAC forces. To your question, I would also be curious about the reintegration. When you talk qualitative, reintegration back with the community, specifically tribal elders and things like that, because often when you're offering assistance in some way, it's flowing through local community leaders, vice directly to individuals. So based on the cultural knowledge of how the system works, albeit limited, that interaction I think would be significant.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, you're absolutely right that 2013, 2014 are also very, very violent. I wasn't meaning to say that they were not violent. It's just that 2018 is really viewed as the peak of this violence. As far as the IED neutralizations, because we're studying this period after the NATO transition, most of the data are coming from Afghan national security forces and not NATO feed-in. And so I think you're right that the US has this kind of more sophisticated counter-IED technology. I still think that ANSF forces in this period are largely reliant on local tips.
That's questionable, because in 2015 they were rolling out ground penetrating radar, mine rollers, EOD bomb suits. So technology was starting to flow there as part of the strategy. And I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm simply saying that may be they're becoming more effective at counter-IED because they have the lead now.
That's absolutely possible. It's not clear to me how that would intersect with refugee return, right? Like you would need to have disproportionate investments in IED defeat technologies in the communities that refugees are returning to versus these other communities. But it's certainly something that we should investigate. I know my co-author Austin has some projects on the IED kind of innovation on the insurgent and counterinsurgent side, and so we'll see if there's data we can draw on, or at least qualitative evidence to answer those.
It's more just fun.
Yeah, appreciate that.
I think Paulina Belikova is next.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting presentation. As you were presenting two separate projects, I was wondering about some powerful selection effects that are going on, and I'm very curious about how you are grappling with them. The first one is how people even end up in Iran and Pakistan. And it's more than the ethnicity question that was asked before, but the types of jobs they're pursuing, how able-bodied are they, and how interesting are they for the insurgent recruiters if they come back home. And second is the selection effect for coming back home, because it seems like the story of Pakistan is mostly a story of people who trust institutions. They're registered through the UNHCR. They also volunteer to be biometrically scanned. So I would assume that more family people who don't plan to have troubles with the law, would be more open to this kind of opportunity, so they self-selected to receiving money. And the question whether this has an amplifying effect on receiving the cash, versus people who will be more vulnerable to the economic costs in Iran. You showed us a picture of construction workers, so able-bodied men, and it's not clear whether they travel with families or without families. Do we know anything about people who decided to stay? Is there a meaningful variation between Afghan refugees who decided to stay in Pakistan versus those who decided to take the cash? And the same about Iran. Maybe it will help you tell a more multidimensional story of selection effects that are going on.
Yeah, these are really fantastic questions. The short answer to do we know anything about people who stay is no, we don't, because they're simply unobserved in the data. We can do some stuff based on, like comparing the catchment beneficiaries or the maximum pressure returnees in this survey of returns demographically to the population that from IOM or UNHCR data that we know lives in Iran or Pakistan, and there's like rough demographic correspondence between the average profile of an Afghan in Pakistan or an Afghan in Iran and who we see in the surveys as having returned to Afghanistan from those contexts in these different waves of return. So the survey evidence gives us some confidence that we are speaking to the average Afghan in either of these settings. You're completely right that there are differences in the populations here, although both Pakistan and Iran host large groups of Afghans and Afghan families that have been there for upwards potentially of 4 decades. Iran does have somewhat more single young men, and so that's absolutely true. But the way that labor force participation works in Afghanistan is that it's virtually always the men that are working and the women that don't necessarily work outside the home unless there's no male head of household. And so I think in both contexts, the thing that's doing the work is like alleviating the men's need, the male members of the household's need to mobilize into violence. And so you should think that aspect is roughly similar in these two contexts. But anyway, yeah, great suggestion, and I'll have to think a bit more about ways that we could maybe address that concern further.
Yeah, can you stand up and introduce yourself, because you're new to our community, and tell us a little bit about your background?
All right, for those of you who have not met me before, I'm Michael Aspinall. I recently just joined the wargaming team. I have a background in game design and development, and so my primary work is focusing on helping automate some of the models and then potentially expanding out some of the war games into a digital format, and then helping either with that development or helping with the introduction of separate tools into those war games as well. So,
All right, you have suggestions about how he can do his war game?
yeah, no, I was mostly going to ask on the topic of the strength of these local institutions with reducing this communal violence. Would some of that economic spillover from the encashed returnees strengthen these particularly community government programs, or the similar local level governance, or does strengthening those institutions need to be like a separate initiative?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it relates to the question you had about the kind of like your cultural knowledge of how this process works in Afghanistan. It's not exactly clear to me how an economic shock would affect the strength of local institutions. Mm-hmm. We're measuring this using pre-treatment data, so there shouldn't be any empirical concerns about it. But I think that in it of itself is an excellent question for future research, and I think some of the work by Jen Murtazashvili and others kind of speaks to this. Fatini's work as well. Professor Christian here at MIT has work on the National Solidarity Program, which is another one of these kind of big development programs that aimed at strengthening local institutions. And so I think we can draw a lot of lessons from a program like that. Although I can't tell you empirically necessarily right now how the economic spillover affected the strength of local institutions. That's a really great question.
Eric, did you have your hand up?
I did. Thank you for the really interesting talk. It seems like you're essentially, your broader story is a political economy story, right? When the labor pool goes up relative to capital, people get jobs working for fighters or selling tips. When capital goes up more than the labor pool, then people don't need to do that. It would seem then that the shocks that are driving this wouldn't be one-time things, right? Because people go back and they stay. And so my question is, did you look at even though the causal story gets heard, did you look at the following years? Did violence stay high in the places where people went back to who was poor? And I would maybe expect violence would go up in the places where encashed refugees returned to because they spent their money and now they're still there but they're poor.
That's absolutely right? So in 2016, the encashment program has a negative effect. The long run effect, which is less well identified, is potentially positive, right? Certainly trending in a positive direction when we look at 2017 in addition to 2016. Yes, and I think it's totally consistent with the expiration of cash, changing the incentives that these folks have. So in terms of policy, I think that suggests that we can't just make these one-off cash transfers. There has to be some kind of durable investment in development in the communities to which individuals are returning. And that's a really important point as we think about potentially scaling a program like that in a different setting.
Charlie Glazer?
I had two simple questions compared to all these sophisticated ones, but one is why two projects? It seems to me that there sort of would be very natural, and I know all the econometric, you like to have real clear comparisons. So this gives you a really good comparison, cash versus no cash. They just seem like one project to me. I mean, I'm sure it's a huge amount of work for each, but just what's the methods? Second question was, you say the cash transfers reduced violence, but it seems like in absolute terms, you would still have more recruits, right? Because all these people are coming back, and now it's just harder to recruit them, but some of them would still be recruited. So are you saying that absolute violence went down, or that violence was less than if they'd come back with no cash. Because it seems to me that it should have gone up in absolute terms.
Just more people.
More people.
Yeah, there's more people than if they didn't come back. So if the measure of violence goes with the number of people, so if that would be right, then you have to fall back on the community prosperity argument, which then maybe on net would reduce recruitment, but it's not an opportunity wage argument at that point.
Why isn't it still an opportunity?
Because you have more people. It's
Right.
harder to get more, but you still have more, so you would have more violence. So to reduce the violence, you have to somehow diminish the overall pool of recruits, which can't come from the people who are coming back. So it has to be from the overall community that's going down, and more than offset the recruits.
Right. That's precisely the story we're interested in telling. Right. The cash grant program is sufficiently sizable that it spills over to the non-migrant neighbors in the destination communities, rises community level reservation wages, and thereby constrains recruitment, despite this otherwise like mechanical positive effect of the population.
Okay, I didn't see it that way. Maybe that's what you said, but I sort of thought you were saying it was the individuals that were coming back were less likely to be recruited.
I think it's the individuals and their non-migrant neighbors who are also indirectly benefiting from the cash.
But it can't really be the individuals, right? Because they're increasing the pool.
They're increasing the pool, but they have no incentive, no economic incentive to mobilize. But nor do their neighbors as a result of this positive.
But some of them, yeah, but are you saying none are recruited? I mean, if any are recruited, then the pool's bigger.
I mean, some are invariably recruited, but some of their non-migrant neighbors are invariably dissuaded from recruitment as well. And so we're looking at absolute violence, and that's what we see going down in 2016 and going up in 2018. Yeah, I can absolutely clarify that going forward. Thank you for that.
Barry, opposed?
Just I have some, maybe to complicate things a little further in your first experiment, the one we're talking about. So if money sloshes around from returnees to residents, it also sloshes around to the Taliban. So the Taliban itself is becoming richer. So that's one question. In other words, which gets me to a second one, which is, do we know anything about Taliban preferences? Maybe when they're rich, they prefer IEDs, and you've made them rich, so they go back into the IED business. Right? And then the other question I guess I have, so that's one path by which the Taliban may be strengthened by this, even in the short term, holding aside which you've discovered in the subsequent year, which brings me to my second question, which is, for some of the research we've had done around here, there is an implication that insurgent groups are big suppliers of adjudication in local disputes. So the question here would be, if you've inadvertently increased the number of local disputes that require adjudication, are you strengthening the role of the Taliban in the community? Right? Which then could say something about the following year. Right? So this all gets back to this question of like money is fungible and it just sloshes around in kind of weird and strange ways, producing consequences that are not what you hoped or what you want.
No, I think that these are excellent points. So just so I'm clear on the first one, right? The way that the Taliban would get money in this story is by taxing returnees. Okay.
They tax. My understanding is that most insurgents in most places find a way to tax a lot of the local activity, right? So yes, they would tax, right? One way or the other, they're going to find a way to tap into that revenue stream, because you're assuming that the neighbors somehow tap into the revenue stream. I can't believe these poor people come back from Afghanistan with pockets full of money and start distributing them everywhere. It increases activity in the economy, and I have to assume that the Taliban have a way to tap into that. So, you're making them richer.
Right, yeah, I think that is a story that's totally consistent, and if the Taliban does derive some economic benefit by taxing this income, then they likely would channel it into the capital-intensive versus labor-intensive forms of violence.
What is their preference? In other words, if they had perfect choice, would they choose bombing or would they choose insurgents? If it was indifferent cost-wise, would those insurgents in those districts choose bombing, or would they choose direct attacks with infantry and RPGs or whatever they can get the locals to use? Right?
Yeah, so I think that extant research would suggest that this is kind of a tough choice because on the one hand, the direct fire sorts of attacks are probably more effective for taking and holding territory, which is in the long run interest of the Taliban is to take over the country. But certainly, right, like if they are deriving tax revenue, then channeling it into the capital-intensive forms of attacks like IED technology is probably the short-term best choice. I think that story is fully consistent with the kind of lethality results that we showed, where lethality of IEDs in particular is increasing. But yeah, this is a great question and something that we can try and incorporate more going forward, either building like qualitative evidence of Taliban taxation. We do have some controls for territorial control, right? So it's very difficult to observe Taliban taxation, but presumably it's occurring in places that are contested or Taliban controlled. And controlling for that doesn't change.
But you're measuring control by geography, not by time of day.
That's absolutely true too, right?
So that measure is not useful.
So this is actually a measure based on survey enumerability, right? So the survey firm is recording when they are prevented from accessing a district or when they face threats to their enumerators in the field. And so it's kind of a nice measure of territorial control for correspondence with the survey-based results in the paper. It's true that we don't observe like daytime versus nighttime control, but it's quite likely that in the places categorized as contested, there's nighttime control, but not necessarily daytime control of the insurgents.
So, can I just have one other point of fact on Paulina's question about selection effects? Do you have a sense of whether the young guys that are coming back from Iran, who've worked construction, many of whom have gone there to make money, relative to the young guys who are coming over with their families from Pakistan, do you have a sense about prior service in militant organizations? In other words, I might imagine that a young guy might be a shooter one season and a construction worker the next, and then go back to shooting the following season. But if you were in Pakistan, you kind of grew up with your family, maybe that's not true, so maybe it's a different recruiting base?
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting question. It's something that we've tried to grapple with empirically pretty recently, right? So it is true that some refugee men from Afghanistan in Iran were trained in what was called the Fatimun, I have a hard time pronouncing it, division, which the Iranians were sending to Syria and elsewhere, right? This is kind of like an Iranian proxy force comprised of Afghan refugee men. And we would expect that those individuals in particular would have these sort of combat skills that would be useful when they return to Afghanistan. We've developed some measures of like where Fatimun division recruits came from in Afghanistan, and we don't see any heterogeneity in the effect of the maximum pressure returns on conflict, depending on like the locations of this particular force. But in general, it's an excellent question, and it's something that we're still trying to disentangle. Another possibility would be that the Iranians, in retribution for U.S. sanctions, want to kind of stick a thorn in the American side as they're trying to extricate themselves from Afghanistan, and so you should see an increase in like anti-NATO violence in this period. This also coincides with when the Doha Accords are starting to be negotiated. And in fact, if we separate out attacks on the Afghan government and attacks on NATO, both are increasing, and so that's possibly consistent with like the Iranians trying to leverage these returnees to poke the United States a bit. But yes, that's something that we're looking forward to incorporating in future versions of the paper. Yes.
Phil, I think you have a follow-up. You were bombing the Taliban from up in the air, so.
Well, and on the ground. So I was in Afghanistan in '04, and the trade-off was not, most of the time, not direct attack to IED, but direct attack to mortar fire or rocket, which was a case of the Viet Cong after '68, and Hezbollah as well. So the question I have is, this may be linked to Barry's question. If your labor costs are going up, it doesn't necessarily mean that you would go to necessarily an IED unless IEDs are cheaper than the mortars. There's some problems with IEDs, which is you don't necessarily target who you want, and you can't signal necessarily as effectively and timely as you can with indirect fire. So did you gather any data on mortar type attacks, and does it follow the IED story as well?
Right, so we do have both direct fires and indirect fires that we measure in the data. Direct fires and indirect fires are generally declining in Project 1 in contrast to the IEDs. So indirect fires look more like direct fires.
So there's not a substitution effect?
Right, there's no substitution effect. Some of this stems from the fact that often the employment of indirect fires is part of like a kind of complex attack or a linked attack where there's going to be like mortar fire followed by heavy machine gun fire or something like that, like an ambush. We can look at those kind of linked events in the data, and they're also increasing. But in general, I think it's fair to characterize indirect fires and like mortars as still more labor intensive than IEDs.
Okay, thanks.
We're running out of time. We got a couple other questions, but I want to come in here because, I just spent a lot of time on Iraq, and I know some of these programs that are opportunity cost based. But as you probably noticed, the Taliban now control Afghanistan. And if you look at that as your outcome, how much did these very clever programs about changing, I don't doubt that we can change the opportunity cost thinking of destitute people by giving them $3,600 in the short run. But my conclusion in Iraq is that there were structural and cultural and identity factors that were just far more important. And if we're going to look at how it all came out, some of these programs that were done by very clever people, this is like Joseph Conrad in The Heart of Darkness, that you're just firing a cannon into the jungle. Maybe you hit a village and did something in the short term, but in the long term, changing these kind of things just doesn't make a lot of difference.
I absolutely appreciate that sentiment. I think the main point for us is that Project 1, right, the cash grant to refugee returnees is not a counterinsurgency program, right? Like the only intention of that cash aid was to get people to leave Pakistan. It wasn't to reduce conflict in Afghanistan. That's just an ancillary, unintended consequence, right? Unlike SIRP or unlike the National Solidarity Program, which are counterinsurgency programs that might have these very short-run tactical effects, but don't amount to strategic victory. And so, I don't think it's necessarily fair to characterize the cash grant program that we're looking at as a counterinsurgency program. It certainly wasn't integrated into kind of like broader U.S. or Afghan security planning. More broadly, I do think it matters because it does, kind of partially help us understand this story about why the Taliban takes over, right? So both Barry and Charlie kind of briefly mentioned this point about how like the Taliban are adjudicating local disputes and integrating into local communities, and that's really the source of their success. And I think certainly in the case of the 2016 program, the increase in communal violence is something that they do capitalize on to kind of create local inroads in these communities that are beneficial in the long run. So maybe telling a small portion of that very big and complicated story there, but this is definitely not a counterinsurgency program. It just has effects on counterinsurgency.
Okay, well, that was the title of your talk, though, how it shapes conflict. But,
conflict and counterinsurgency,
yeah.
inseparable.
Okay, all right. We got a couple questions. I'm going to take them, and then you can respond to them the way you want. I know Rich has a question, and then Chicago. Anybody else want to get in the queue? And Ken, then we'll stop.
Cool. Good luck. Now is when the indirect fires start getting long. Mine builds, I think, on the last, actually, like 5 comments. So I'll say it this way. They're not implicated in what I say. I just drew inspiration. I thought you had shown me a miracle, which was a repatriation program that did not increase violence, or more generally, a US/UN policy that did not backfire, which is the thing about the Iran sanctions, which is so funny in your finding, is it's just like, oh, wonderful, like maybe we hurt Iran, or maybe we had this like incredibly awkward withdrawal a few years later. And then I think between Charlie and the stream of comments there, it's a bit more complicated, like what the long run effects are. If you were a policymaker trying to design a repatriation program, which parts of your research are most helpful to that policymaker, and which are you like, we don't know yet? Like, because it felt like there were parts, I mean, the iris scanning thing, I'm like, oh, that actually, who knows? Like maybe a lot of people here at MIT want to AI their way to solutions. So I'm curious what you would say to that policymaker. But you have 2 other questions coming, so you can.
Should I take all?
I think you should take all. Yeah, take all the questions now, Chicago.
Thank you. Very interesting. I learned a lot. I'm still a bit unclear on a few points. The capital versus labor. I understood the labor part, that they're richer, so it's harder to recruit. I didn't quite understand why that might increase the capital. Is that because it was harder to recruit? Is that because, as Barry was suggesting, that the recruiter, the Taliban, was also getting richer from that? Do you have you sort of answered that already to a certain extent, but I wasn't quite sure the mechanism that you were offering. 2, is there a way, this is a policy prescription part, if you wanted to sort of strengthen the local community, is there a way to give money to the receiving communities without that money going into the Taliban? The 3rd, you mentioned about the people that were coming from, that were iris scanned, were eligible. And you often use the word eligible. I wasn't quite sure if that meant that they had to be qualified of who they are, what they are. And you said that after they returned to the country, they were then given the money, not before. And since going into all that trouble of iris screening, that seems to be quite a lot to just give out $400 to me. So is it possible to give them in installments after they actually return, so that you can be sure that they stay good in some ways? Not just give the money right away, but after. It might be difficult, but there are certain stations you showed on the map for them to return like a year after. Is that something that is realistic, possible? That might make a difference.
Okay. Chris, loved your study, and I'm actually very happy to be batting cleanup here, because my question is actually on extensions and implications. The toughest cases that we can deal with are not actually the ones that you covered. It would actually be those situations where you have refugees warehoused in a situation where return is really difficult by virtue of conditions in ethno-religious conflicts, and where third-party resettlement is difficult. We could be talking about obscure cases like Gaza, or we could be talking about the Rohingya. In those cases, is there anything from your current work that you would draw on to offer, if you will, advice? And I know that would be a little limited, but if you were doing a study to inform our deliberation on those toughest of cases, what kind of a study would you do?
Yes, well, thank you all 3 of these.
Sorry, I know that's unfair.
I'll see you at lunch, so you can just punt on lunch.
Huge food for thought. I think there's a lot of kind of common themes across these questions, so maybe I can quickly answer. As far as this miracle of a repatriation program that doesn't backfire, it's absolutely true that the long run effects are very complicated here. One kind of very tractable implication, I think, is that the iris scanning biometric registration process was very effective at reducing corruption around this, right? That's something that the UNHCR is scaling across the settings right now because of positive kind of consequences observed in this program. More broadly, I think, some of the points I made about the need for kind of durable cash assistance and not a one-off, and this speaks to separating cash in phases. I think that those are very kind of potentially promising programs to trial in the future, although I can't speak to any evidence around that, because as far as I know, they haven't been tried. In terms of this mechanism question about declining labor and increasing capital-intensive violence, maybe one thing that we can do is incorporate some of the pre-treatment data that we have from the CENTCOM record of SIGACs prior to 2015, which does record instances of Taliban taxation and at least kind of looking at heterogeneity or controlling for historical Taliban taxation might give us some leverage over whether the increase in IEDs is because the Taliban prefer IEDs when they're kind of taxing income or something like that. So stay tuned for a more concrete answer there. In terms of strengthening local communities without strengthening the insurgents, incredibly difficult to do this. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's much promise here. Although, giving amounts of money so small that people are kind of using it up immediately might be one way to mitigate the effect of a cash transfer on insurgent taxation, right? If you just give enough for transportation, a transportation allowance and then a housing allowance, potentially you offset that effect, although, it's difficult to say. As far as eligibility, I think that's just a clarification point, but in the survey of returnees, we don't actually observe people that we know for a fact received the cash grant. We're backing this out on the basis of when they returned, what their registration status was, and where they returned from, and so we're calling them likely encashment beneficiaries or people eligible for the beneficiary. Or for the cash grant. And finally, yes, extensions, these tough cases like Gaza or Myanmar, I think it's incredibly difficult to see an easy path for facilitating refugee return in those settings. Obviously, I think, building up things like social capital and strong local institutions is one implication of our research that is potentially promising. Maybe incorporating some sort of peace-building intervention where you try to kind of generate positive outgroup attitudes prior to facilitating return could be useful. Also targeting host communities and not just forcibly displaced communities with the cash transfer is potentially promising. But yes, I think it's all fantastic questions that I'm interested in tackling in future research as well. I really appreciate being here.
All right, thank you very much, Chris.